everyone. I'm from the UK, as you know, and today I'm going to talk to you about trying to actually implement an evidence-based intervention for partner violence, which is a really big thing in the UK. We are required to actually show an evidence base both for the theory of an intervention and also to evaluate evidence of efficacy and so forth. This is being enforced in the UK in all areas apart from partner violence interventions, unfortunately. Now, unfortunately, there is going to be repetition because I wrote my talk and then I've just listened to Don's talk and so forth. So please forgive me. I'll go over some bits faster and so forth, but I suppose everybody has a different take on research. If I'm not clear on something or you want to make a comment, just shout out and I'll be happy to take them as we go through. So, I'm going to talk about the what works literature. So this is a literature base which is attempted through meta-analyses to actually look at what works in rehabilitating offenders. And I'm going to sort of then subject Duluth to what works scrutiny, if you will. Then we're going to have a look on the risk factors for intimate partner violence and touch on the similarities with non-intimate partner violence, so violence towards strangers, colleagues and so forth. Then have a look at evidence-based practice and contrast the Duluth model with a programme for generally violent offenders which has just been developed in the UK called Life Minus Violence. And then there's a checklist for evaluation at the end. So Maguire tells us that the what works literature is based upon the systematic statistical analysis of the efficacy of treatment programmes for criminal behaviour. So this is all types of criminal behaviour: theft, mugging, aggression, homicide. And through this process, elements of the more successful programmes are identified. So what works and what doesn't work. And hopefully, with the aim that such information can then guide practice for us to actually continually develop our literature base so we can continually finesse our programmes and increase efficacy. So what works tells us that absolutely fundamentally, before we can try and treat a problem, we have to understand the behaviour, the problem that we're hoping to treat. And it sounds obvious, but as we'll see, maybe this is one of these fundamental steps which hasn't been met. We then need to identify risk factors which are likely to be criminogenic, so things which are contributing to that offending behaviour. We have to conduct individualised assessments of risk. So we have to, although we could say overall these are risk factors for partner violence, we have to find out for each individual we are seeking to treat what their own risk profile is. We need to target the dynamic risk factors, those that can be changed, evaluate individual change and programme efficacy. So the what works literature, its first principle is understand the criminal behaviour you're hoping to intervene and treat. So you've got a range of factors that you can look at, and these range from the distal, sort of societal, political structures and so forth, coming nearer to sort of neighbourhood political structures, so norms within a neighbourhood may differ to other neighbourhoods. Interpersonal networks, so the actual people that somebody in a neighbourhood interacts with daily or weekly, so their sort of personal circle. Personal factors, the psychological profile of the individual, their own personal history, an immediate situation. So nobody is, say, violent in all situations, nobody is violent all the time. So there's obviously certain situations which trigger aggression and other situations that don't. So the traditional model, which obviously you all know this, is Duluth, and it's the most widely used battery programme in the world. It's the Accreditation System in the UK, an organisation called Respect, have been given the job by the UK government to accredit all programmes, and they are strongly of the belief in these premises of beliefs that intimate partner violence is male to female, that men's, unlike women's, violence is control motivated. They, on their website, they tell us the theory that anger causes violence simply didn't resonate with most battered women's experiences. So the Duluth helps offenders understand their socialised beliefs about male dominance. I mean, I've got a problem with that straight away. As a forensic psychologist, although battered women's experiences and perceptions are useful and interesting and valuable, they are not qualified to design programs. Programs should not be based on, it should be based on literature, clinical literature and academic literature. So you've seen all this already, so I'll whiz through. John Archer is a co-worker at the School of Psychology where I work. He was my PhD supervisor. When I first met John, I tapped on his door and said I wanted to do a PhD on partner violence on women's victimisation. And John said, well, I think you better go away and read the literature on sex similarity. And I was like, well, that's so, okay, I'll go look at it. I didn't believe it could be true. So I had a look, and then I had another look, and another look. And it really concerned me, because I thought, it isn't like this. Why is this data showing this similarity when clearly it's men, really, who are the perpetrators? It disturbed me. So I found Johnson's typology, thought, eureka, I can, keep my worldview. And that's what I did my PhD on, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But while I was with John, he was conducting a meta-analysis, and I helped him with some of the coding of the papers. And as you already know, massive sample, many studies, 82 studies, and that found that women more likely to choose one or act of aggression, men more likely to inflict injury. But John was very surprised at the level of injury that men were reporting. He was expecting really probably 90% of those injured to be women. So he was really surprised. And I think it's worth noting that sometimes this differential injury rate is used to say that men and women's aggression is motivated more by different things because men commit more injury. But with all things being equal, a man and a woman using the same acts with the same intensity, in relation to their body strength, men will be more injurious. Boxing weights vary by like 3 kilos between, one boxing category and the next because of the massive impact that body weight has on injury ability. So that was interesting. It caused a massive stir. Any paper I ever review that doesn't have John's paper in the first paragraph gets a correction. But the problem really, maybe with the research, is it was dominated by US samples, and it was dominated also by dating relationships and university students. It's not to say it's not an important base, but obviously there are selection factors. So John in 2006 conducted a cross-national survey and looked at a lot of European countries and other countries, and he confined himself to community data, and he found the same thing. Slightly more female aggression than male, but really parity, nothing really worth getting excited about. Oh, okay. And Philbert's bibliography, we all know about that. Now, the studies where you'll find that men are the primary perpetrators, we've already again discussed this, are likely to be ones such as the Dobash's work, where they sample on their DV, is the term Richard Felsen used, and that's your dependent variable. So if you go to a shelter where the women are already identified as victims of severe male violence, and then you ask them, are you a victim of severe male violence? It's not surprising that that's what you're finding. It is really equivalent to going to a Mensa meeting and selecting your male sample, and then just getting a general population of women, comparing the groups and saying men are more intelligent than women. It's the same type of thing to do, and I don't think anyone would buy it. Something else the Dobashers have said is that the data must be wrong about similarity because there's no theory to explain it. But men are committing crimes at higher rates, certainly personal violent crimes, but women sort of across the world, across time periods. And this is true, but it doesn't negate the findings. Terry Moffat's work, a longitudinal study, followed boys and girls, and they're still following them now in adulthood. And you find when you ask for parent and teacher reports, boys self-report more aggressive behaviour. When you look at self-reports of offending behaviour, boys self-report, boys are higher than girls. Informants, so you ask somebody else, what does X do? Then boys are higher on aggression than girls. If you look at convictions, boys are higher on aggression than girls. If you go to self-reports of domestic violence, girls are higher than boys. Women are higher than men. If you go to partner reports of domestic violence, women, again, are offending at higher rates than men. And if you look at clinically significant domestic violence, so domestic violence that actually resulted in injury or some type of official intervention, you find no statistical difference between the prevalence of male versus female perpetrators. And as we'll see later, there are theories to explain this data. Longitudinal cohort studies find the same thing. The beauty of these studies is they're all now, a lot of these studies have been following people from birth or even prenatally, and now they're all starting to add partner violence information in. And they're all finding pretty similar findings. Don Dutton does a nice summary in his 2007 article. So this is really the area I did my PhD on, and I continue to research this idea of control. Because the response was, first it was women don't use domestic violence. And then eventually, the massive weight of data was just impossible to ignore. So then people are left with two options: accept it and move on, or move the goalposts, change it so that, it's not aggression, it's different in another way. And one of the ways they've had to try to do this is by saying men are controlling in their aggression, so it's different, it's worse. And this is a quote by Doug Brownridge. He says, women with partners who exhibit patriarchal dominance, defined through preventing access to family income, have far higher odds of intimate partner violence victimisation. And Evan Stark, who I had the pleasure to meet last month, says that the pattern of intimidation, isolation and control is unique to men's abuse of women. Now, I was presenting a very, very feminist conference. I have no idea why they asked me. And by the look on everybody's face, they had no idea why they'd asked me either. But once I got the lineup, I was really sort of getting rather paranoid, thinking, is it a setup? Why are they asking me? But I had a look at the lineup, and this Evan Stark, Coercive Control, and I thought, I've never heard of this. So I ran out, bought his book, read it in a week. And what he says was, where it gets to this idea, that this quote here, he actually says, take this on faith. It's like, he's got a fantastic literature review up to that point. And then his central premise of his book, I've got to take on faith. And I did ask him about it when we met. And that really is as far as he goes. His book then is just full of anecdote, and they are awful stories. They really are. But Philip Cook has got a book full of awful stories of male victimisation. So Johnson is where I came into this debate. Johnson wrote a piece in 1995 and continues to write these pieces to this day, talking about how you can reconcile the pro-feminist philosophy of coercive male violence with the data that men and women commit equally prevalent as aggressors. So he decided this control-based typology, two types of aggressor. One who is low control, so they use their aggression because they're having an argument and they lose their temper, but it's not part of a general pattern of coercive behaviour. And they're a common or situational couple violence. Controlling aggression is patriarchal terrorism. He changed it later when he had to accept there were some women who fell under this label to intimate terrorism. And this is where you've got somebody who's using violence and aggression in the relationship, but they're using high levels of controlling behaviour as well. And Michael Johnson felt that this would reconcile the data, and really it allows us to carry on doing what we're doing, because we say, well, obviously the incidence of domestic violence is very high. We could never even hope to intervene in 20% of the population's relationships. So if we just look at the intimate terrorism, then we find they're all men, go back to square one, and we're fine. And I liked this idea. I thought it fits the data, and it lets me keep my worldview, and everybody's happy. And the first studies we did, myself and John Archer, we sampled in a shelter, we sampled male prisoners, battery programs, students. Oh yeah, and we categorised, and we found that intimate terrorists were predominantly male. But we sampled on our dependent variable. We sampled highly victimised women, but we didn't sample highly victimised men. So we repeated the analysis with a larger sample, which was collected online through the university we work at. So it obviously maybe isn't a high-risk sample, but only a third of the sample were actually employees. Most of those were from administration, but we had like groundsmen and so forth. And the university I work at is actually a very low SES area and very sort of low SES students as well. So we've got a large sample for this type of research, 400 men, nearly 1,000 women. We categorised the study in exactly the same way and found equal numbers of intimate terrorists for men and women. Men and women were equally likely to be an intimate terrorist. I presented this work and I sent a copy to Michael Johnson, who emailed me back saying, you know, really interesting, but what you've done is you've actually set the threshold too low. You need to up the bar, so you need a higher level of control, and then you'll find that it's men. So I said, okay. Reanalysed the data, lifted the bar so it was a lot higher, still equality. So I looked at the sort of scatter plots, and what you find is just a linear relationship between control and aggression for men and women. Johnson knows this research, he's reviewed it and for publications, he's conversed with me, yet he never ever refers to this research in any of his work, although he always cites my earlier papers. And he continues to say that intimate terrorism is male. This is in spite of really an absence of data, and the tiny bits of data which are there do not support this. Myself and a postgraduate student have reanalysed the Statistics Canada database, looking at current relationships only, and classified them as intimate terrorists versus common couple violence, and again found gender symmetry. So, okay, so if men and women are equally likely to be intimate terrorists, we can maybe move away from gender now and start looking at psychological risk and so forth. No. Control is different for men and women. It's the next explanation. So I thought, okay, so it's different. So maybe women are using control to manage a relationship, to equalise unequal power structures. How would I test that? That's how I thought. I thought, well, what do we know about controlling aggression and men? Well, we know men who use aggression and control tend to be have hostility, personality disorder, violence approval, and so forth. Dixon and Brown, Hawksworth, Malone, Stewart have found this. So I thought, okay, let's see if men and women differ on these measures. And I won't go through all the studies. Over the years, we've been doing like a variety of studies looking at different factors. And what we found almost invariably is there is no difference between men and women's associations with their controlling behaviour and different variables. So instrumental beliefs about aggression relates to men and women's controlling behaviours. So people who believe, I use aggression to get my own way, to make them do X or Y. Expressive beliefs about aggression also. So people say, I've lost my temper and I lashed out. The same relationship between controlling behaviour and these beliefs are for men and women. Proactive, reactive aggression is sort of similar to instrumentality and expressiveness, a different way of looking at it. Again, the same. Dependency is related to controlling behaviours in men and women. Entitlement, I thought this has got to be men. No, same for men and women. particularly narcissistic expectations that you're the important one and you expect people to do your bidding, and self-promotion. It goes on. Assaultive behaviour, indirect aggression, irritability, negativity, resentment, suspiciousness, verbal hostility, guilt, personality disorder traits, particularly histrionic, narcissistic, paranoid, antisocial, borderline and dependent. All these are similar for men and women in the study and related to their controlling behaviours. And I found since as well a study that's looked at childhood bullies, and they found that men and women identified as being bullies at school were predicted their partner violence in adulthood. And what they said was these people lacked conflict resolution skills, they had negative interactions with their friends and peers, and they were very controlling in their friendships in childhood. And these behaviour carried on until adulthood into intimate relationships. So it suggests to me at least that controlling behaviour is a stable, coercive, interpersonal style. And it seems to be associated with the same variables in men and women, and it's also associated with the same variables that aggression is. So I personally think that control and partner violence are actually symptoms of the same cause in an individual. Now, the cause will differ between people. If somebody is psychopathic, they may use control and aggression maybe to stop their partner going out because they want their dinner cooking. That's the motivation. Whereas somebody else who's maybe got borderline personality disorder may use control and aggression to stop their partner going out because they're afraid that they'll meet somebody else and leave them. So the cause in individuals can differ, but I believe that control and aggression are really aspects of the same underlying motivation. I'll just have a quick drink. So, what does the literature tell us about the risk factors for partner violence? Now, in this review, apart from the studies of my own, self-promotion, of course, I've confined myself to meta-analyses and longitudinal data. The actual research data on sort of partner violence, I used PsycInfo and did a literature search, and just using partner violence, domestic violence, you get about 8,000 articles. If you Google domestic violence on Google Scholar, you'll get 800,000 hits. It's a large area and we don't want to be here for years and years. So what I wanted to do is actually just try and use the most rigorous studies. So studies that have either got lots of data, a meta-analysis, or a longitudinal, well-designed study, so that we can really look at the studies, we can be reasonably sure of the findings. So, 1996 meta-analysis found very little support for the idea that patriarchy is the driving force in interpartner violence. Sandra Stith conducted a meta-analysis in 2004 and found that it provides support for the importance of examining intimate partner violence from a multifactorial perspective. Now, she looked at, it's not very clear, I'm sorry about that, sort of all levels of this really, from your distal to your sort of psychological. Most of the data was on men because most of the research is on male perpetrators. What she found was there was a variety of risk factors, but the only ones that really, you could say, in any way tapped into this idea of Duluth's philosophy, which is guiding principle, was traditional sexual ideology, which was a moderate risk factor in one category. It does not give us any, it did not provide any support for interventions based on this factor alone. And it certainly wasn't the strongest predictor. So it is there for some men, but it isn't as important as certainly a Duluth sort of model thinks. Longitudinal research on risk factors. The problem with the meta-analysis where you're using studies is they're actually cross-sectional. So you don't know if somebody's alcohol use came before their partner violence, at the same time, or after. You can only imply causation. With a longitudinal study, you actually follow people before the behaviour you're interested in, and then you can really see what did come before. They're the most rigorous. and so forth. Dutton talks about them in his 2007 paper. So what hostile talk about women, that's sort of a Duluth idea. When you actually look at hostile talk about women, it doesn't predict antisocial behaviour. It correlates with boys' partner violence. So if you ask hostile talk about women, partner violence, they'll be correlated. You'll think, there's a relationship. But when you put in other variables, it's not significant. So boys' antisocial behaviour is what pushes this. So a boy with antisocial behaviour is likely to be hostile towards women. He's also likely to be hostile towards pretty much everybody. That is what antisocial behaviour is. You're only measuring hostility to women because you as a researcher thinks that's what's driving it. Emotional regulation. So the research really hasn't found any association between, no support for this idea that partner violence is all male or partner violence is motivated by sort of male beliefs of entitlement and so forth. So what risk factors are involved? Well, emotional regulation seems to be an important one. So all these studies sort of talk about partner violence, but I think we've done this already, sort of prevalence rates. We found that parent-child boundaries at 13 years old predicted partner violence in adulthood. So these are things which were happening before people were dating or married. The personality of the victims and perpetrators at 25 is measured, was measured earlier. So there's something that they do in the literature where we say women who use partner violence do it because they're depressed. Well, and it causes depression, but they're using cross-sectional studies. These allow us to actually look at the causation. So this parent-child boundary violations was really something called parentification, where parents treated their children almost like they were friends with them, or the parent became a child. Children who have this type of relationship with their parents failed to learn to regulate their own emotions and developed overtly emotionally dependent interpersonal styles. So the need to regulate emotional proximity. They're very, very dependent people, but they often lack the actual interpersonal skills to maintain intimate relationships. And that causes a great amount of anxiety. Emotional closeness isn't really, for most people, it isn't an option. We all need to be close to people emotionally. It's a basic human need. If you have a problem regulating your emotional proximity, it's going to cause anxiety and stress. In these people, it resulted in their use of controlling behaviour to try and manage that anxiety and manage the need for emotional proximity. And the controlling behaviour predicted partner violence. The same for men and women. They said deficient skills in regard to managing conflict and negative emotions in intimate relationships may be rooted in familiar experiences and may persist into the close relationships of adults. So this is for men and women. This is not telling us that, men and women differ, and it's telling us that where people end up is not the result of being involved in a violent relationship, it's the predictor of being involved. Antisocial behaviour, Capaldi and Clark, they looked at aggression to partners, and they found that parents' antisocial behaviour worked through to unskilled parenting, to a boy's antisocial behaviour, and predicted partner violence. And this is, I think, something that we should take away regarding policy. There's clear evidence now from Richard Tremblay's work that parenting classes has a massive impact. And what this type of model shows, that where you've got antisocial parents, they are quite easy to spot. And this profile, if you can sort out the parenting, you can actually really make a big impact on later offending behaviour and partner violence. They followed up in 2004 and then asked the men and the men's partners, and they found that assortative mating, so men who had depression tended to pair up with women who were depressive. Men's antisocial behaviour predicted their psychological and physical partner violence. Men's depression predicted their psychological aggression. Women's antisocial behaviour and depression predicted their partner violence and psychological aggression. Further, women's depression resulted in more men's violence towards them and prospectively predicted psychological aggression. So the current findings suggest that both partners' levels of psychopathology increase for levels of partner abuse. It's important to consider aggression-associated psychopathology for both partners. So here we're learning that psychopathology is an important aspect of partner violence. And also that it's often the interaction of two people's psychopathology which creates the environment for partner violence to occur. Terry Moffitt's work, which Don Dutton talked about, and he's pretty much gone through this, but men and women identified as having conduct disorder 3 years prior to perpetrating partner violence were more likely to team up with violent partners, but regardless of whether their partners hit them or not, they hit their partners. And the relationship was very similar for women and men. So there's a direct relationship between conduct disorder and partner violence for men and women, and an indirect relationship which goes through their partner's behaviours. It's pretty much the same again. Personality, we've looked at this is looking at people from just before marriage to 30 years into marriage. They find defendants, which is, I would say, really a hostile attributional style, so people who take offence easily, are mistrustful of other people, feel it's important to get even when somebody does you wrong. And personality factors predicted psychological aggression, which then predicted physical aggression. Childhood risk factors for men, witnessing parental violence. For women, it was their own use of aggression in the home. And you can see that. For men, their aggression, violence towards parents had a direct route to physical aggression. Defendants, an aggressive sort of interpersonal style, went through psychological aggression and into physical aggression, which suggests actually that working on people's psychological aggression could break the chain for men. Women's partner violence was predicted by them hitting their parents as children and hitting their peers, and also they went through psychological aggression. So you see risk factors which are nothing to do with societal expectations or patriarchy. They're actually about poor parenting and psychology. These are similar again. This is for looking at stress. Duluth said it isn't. Stress isn't important. Stress is very important. People who cannot regulate their emotions when put under stress find it very hard to cope and are far more vulnerable to using aggression. So I think we all know this anyway, but it's worth just reiterating, it is complex. So Duluth has men, patriarchy, partner violence. Whereas the sort of data, just O'Leary's alone, says for women, you've got a model similar to this. For men's, you've got a model like this. Dominance predicting both men and women's aggression. And I actually meant to do this and I forgot. Murray Strauss in 1974 published a diagram, I think more complex than this, about family violence. And I found it when I was a postgraduate student. I thought, oh, no, I'm never going to get my PhD if I've got to look at all this. But really, you know, we knew 40 years ago it was complex. And yet for the last 35, it's like we've all pretended it's actually, you know, driven by one factor. So, to summarise, men and women appear more similar than different. There's little support for patriarchy, no support for patriarchy being a primary treatment target of choice. Evidence for a range of dynamic risk factors. So this, historical risk factors such as childhood abuse it's good to know this when you're predicting dangerousness, but it doesn't really help for a treatment target because you can't go back and change that. What you need to think about when you're thinking about treatment is what's dynamic, what is amenable to change, what can we actually intervene in and try and reduce that risk factor. There's evidence for a similarity between intimate partner violence and other types of aggression. The studies that we've talked about, the longitudinal studies, are actually, most of them were set up to look at violent, delinquent, offending behaviour, and they've added partner violence in. And these predictive risk factors are predicting general aggression, general offending, and partner violence. So my radical thing to mention now possibly is, do we need separate interventions for partner violence, or can we just treat it as violence generally? That's probably a little bit too far for a lot of people at the conference. So hopefully we've sort of had a look at the risk factors, and the research certainly suggests that there is no support for this monolithic model, and we need to really be far more risk-based, academically driven. So in the UK, traditionally people, I've actually heard people saying this at forensic meetings. Oh, I was asked to design a drug treatment or a violence program, so I went and wrote it, and I wrote it in a week. You know, and they're chuffed. I did a little bit of this, a little bit of that. They haven't really done any reading. They've maybe consulted a previous program, took out some bits they liked, so forth. And that's what we've been doing in the UK. It's not surprising that criminal rates have not dropped. What works literature is telling us is this is not good enough. I mean, what really frustrates me is the research I do is paid for by the UK taxpayers. You know, they pay for people to go to university. And so the government's paying for it, and yet the government's ignoring it. And that is criminal in itself. So it was really nice when I was consulted on a program called Life Minus Violence for violent offenders. We have rehabilitation programs for violent offenders, drug offenders, and so forth. In fact, partner violence is probably one of the less common ones, if you will, in the UK. It's gaining, more groups are being set up. So Life Minus Violence is just for aggressive offenders, anyone, any type of offender who uses aggression habitually, so more than once is how it's defined. It's been designed to take advantage of academic and theoretical developments in the aggression research. And I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about it, because it's all very well me standing here saying, well, you know, use the literature, do your interventions from there. Well, how? How do I do that? As a clinician, how do I actually convert research articles into a session with an offender? So that's what I thought. I'd just very briefly go through this and show you how it has been done and how it can be done. So it focuses on developments in the field of social cognition, emotional intelligence, learning theory, and developmental trajectories of aggression. It's process-orientated. Something that's been missing from Duluth is men, patriarchy, partner violence. Well, what's the process? What's the mechanism? Why does one thing lead to the other? I want to know not just what happens, but why does it happen? This is process-orientated. So it looks at the process by which people come to use aggression. You know, what are the thought processes and so forth. It's based on the what works literature. It's firmly embedded within that. And it has a range of empirically supported theories on aggression. So just to give you, they're the theories which have been applied in the model. And these are theories that if you put those into a academic database, you will get hits 2007, 2001. These are current, academically accepted, well-researched theories. You know, these are things that academics say these are good theories. They're not some outdated ideological concept. So, you can use the academic literature to create an intervention. But what you need to do is really think about risk maybe in a different way. When I was talking to people at the conference last month, they were talking about risk, and I was talking about risk, but what they were talking about was risk prediction for dangerousness. So how dangerous is this person? I was talking about risk regarding risk factors I would want to work on in an intervention. So I think we need to be clear that risk assessment of dangerousness is always your first priority. How dangerous is this person? What do I need to do to secure, keep the victim safe and stop this person reoffending? And that's fine. But once you start thinking about how are we going to change this person, how are we going to stop this person reoffending, you've got to actually assess dynamic risk factors for that individual. So things like impulsivity is something that you can work on in a session. So you assess dynamic risk factors, and then you actually identify what are the criminogenic ones, which risk factors are pushing that behaviour, and which ones are not. Some things aren't very nice. Some people in the UK, they have this whole thing about rapists, that, they needed to clean up a bit, get their hair cut, wash their face, brush their teeth. If they actually looked after their sort of hygiene, they'd be able to get a girl. People spent a lot of money doing this. All they did was actually get cleaner rapists, because personal sort of hygiene, although it wasn't very pleasant, was not a criminogenic risk factor. It wasn't related to their offending, it was tangential. So you use your dynamic risk factors to develop your treatment targets. So if we have impulsivity, the need factor is behaviour control. This person needs to learn to control their own behaviour. So a treatment target, increased self-control. There's an increasing acceptance in the aggression literature, but we've got to move away from defining aggression by its nature and more by its motivation. So we'll say partner violence as if that tells us anything. It doesn't tell us anything other than the victim-perpetrator relationship. It doesn't tell us why somebody used aggression. It just tells us what the relationship between the victim and perpetrator was. So I'm just very briefly going to just remind you all, I'm sure you know this already, reinforcement and punishment, massively researched area, a lot of credibility. When you talk about positive reinforcements, it's what is positively reinforcing a behaviour. People who use aggression more than once do so because something is coming out of this which is good. It could be a positive reinforcement, so you gain something you want. Increased status within the home. I hit my husband, and he learns not to take me on, and so I'm the king of the castle. Feelings of self-efficacy. I feel that I'm powerful, potent. Resolution of conflict. He stopped going on. We made up. Positive reinforcement is one of the strongest reinforcements for encouraging the recurrence of behaviour. In lab tests and everything else, positive reinforcement works better than anything else to make that behaviour more likely to occur next time. Now, negative reinforcement, I've had this argument with my brother for weeks, and he won't believe me, is not the same as punishment. Negative reinforcement is the removal of something unpleasant. So if I'm feeling really, really upset and frightened that my husband's going to go out and meet somebody else and leave me, then I've got really negative effect. I start an argument with him, and we have a fight, and he doesn't go out, and then I feel relaxed. It's removed a negative feeling, so it's a negative reinforcer. Compared to punishment, which is the application of something aversive, like arrest or the partner leaving you or whatever. So why does that matter with what we're talking about? Well, before you decide on why somebody has used partner violence, you have to actually find out why they use partner violence. So something we use in the UK is the SORC functional assessment. I don't know if you've come across it. And this asks, use it through interview and file information. You actually look at a whole level of variables. So the organism variables, what is that person's historical context of their behaviour? So they've got head injury, fear of abandonment, substance use, personality disorder, psychopathy, a history of conflictual relationships, previous relationships dissolved through conflict, jealousy and so forth. This is something that person walks around with on their day-to-day life. It's their history. So what are the setting conditions? So what you say is, on the last time you used aggression or your index offence, what was going on just prior to the use of aggression? Well, we were having an argument, I'd been drinking, she was flirting with somebody else, I was feeling jealous, she was telling me I had to do X, Y, and Z, I was feeling controlled, neighbours rang the police, now my neighbours know, these are all the things which are building up in somebody. feeling annoyed and angry, feeling unwanted and useless. These are your triggers. This person, this is what was salient to them. So what's the behaviour sequence? What happens next? Well, this is based on a study of a woman, actually, who killed her partner. So she stabbed her partner twice with a pair of scissors. So you know what the person carries around. You know what the immediate situation triggers were. You know what the behaviour consequences were. What were the consequences for the perpetrator? So in this case, she felt relieved. I mean, she didn't feel, it wasn't related to her partner bleeding, but he stopped. He just stopped going on at me. This is what she said. She felt a massive relief. So a real negative reinforcement, a removal of negative effect. Her anger reduced. That was good. Anger's not a nice feeling. So again, another negative reinforcing. It increased her perception of being socially effective. She felt potent, so it was a positive reinforcer. She was subsequently arrested and imprisoned, so obviously that was a punishment. But once you understand this, you start seeing where that individual is coming from when they use aggression. This woman could have had all different consequences. She could have been guilt-ridden and so forth. She could have been entirely unconcerned. So you need to look at each person's individual reactions, really. So what was the function of the behaviour for her? Well, it served to increase her feelings of control. It was a method of conflict resolution. It served a coping function, and it allowed her to control and manage her own negative emotions. So for treatment, the clinician said she needed anger management, emotional regulation, violence management, problem solving, assertiveness training, and self-esteem interventions. So you can see how looking at the risk individually for each person sets your targets then. You know now what you need to work with for that one person. On top of that, you need to assess the full range of potential risk factors. So from the literature on partner violence, and certainly from the general aggression literature, you should be looking at impulsivity, poor emotional regulation, hostile attribution bias, beliefs about aggression, conflict resolution, interpersonal skills. What you can do with this is you can both compare it to population norms. So when you're evaluating a program, you've often got a tiny sample size. You can't really do any statistical analysis, so it's very hard to really know whether it's really moved anybody in the right direction. If you're using good normed measures, you can compare your person pre-treatment, see where they differ from a normal population, so you can see where their risk factors seem atypical, and at the end you can reassess them and see where they've moved. Have they come into the norm? Have they moved from 4 standard deviations from norm down to 1 or 2? And you can also, I think this is really important, identify treatment need and strengths. So what the best treatments must be ones which build on people's strengths. So if somebody's got poor impulse control but high empathy, then that tells you this person has a real strength. We can build on that. We can build on that strength and help. You know, if somebody has a different profile, then you can use different strengths and weaknesses. And it's also far nicer for the offender or the perpetrator to be told, you know, you've got risk in these areas, but you're really strong in this. You know, you're strong in these areas. It's far nicer than someone just saying, you know, you're a waste of space, which is how it must sound often. So Life Minus Violence program has 5 core treatment areas for aggression. Information processing, emotional acceptance, reactivity regulation, developmental changes, includes learning history, but people do change over time. For example, instrumental beliefs tend to change to more expressive as people get older, just naturally, regardless of any intervention. Aggression motivation and relapse prevention. So one of the modules is called information processing. This is based on Raoul Huseman's work, and he looks at social scripts, massive literature on this. And this is what you should be doing when you're looking for a program. If you're trying to decide, when they give it something, go and have a look. What's the literature? Who's using this? Who's referring to this now? If they're using a 1982 reference, forget it. If nobody's talked about this since 1982, it's maybe a rare gem that we've all missed, and it does happen. But more likely is it's been found to not really be useful, and everyone moved on. Normative beliefs. These are beliefs that an individual holds and that they think other people hold. So I might believe that it's okay to hit my partner, and I would think, well, everyone thinks that. You know, I see it on telly, I see women hitting men. On the plane over, there was something called Moving McAllister. It's some film you'd never watch unless you're on a plane for 8 hours. But right at the end, this really beautiful woman, this guy turns up and he was going to go and he comes back, you know, predictable. But he runs up and says her name and she turns around and she full punches him right in the side of her head, absolutely highly aggressive. I was like, and then he goes, oh, what was that for? And she goes, oh, you so-and-so, remember hugging, everything's fine. So if I was using partner aggression, I would certainly think it was normative, and I'd probably be right. It's funny. We see it on telly all the time. Women are always smacking men. Well, I certainly see it. Maybe I'm just hypersensitive to it all now. Emotions, so the affects the ability to process information, how emotions help activate beliefs, and script choice as well, and hostile attribution. So what this does is it builds on a massive amount of forensics, cognitive, social research, which has been going on for years and years and years. A lot of it isn't on partner violence, but people are people. We have the same brains, and, you know, the processes that lead me to decide to use aggression are the same processes, you know, parts of my brain that I decide if I want tea or coffee. So your social script, these are trigger events, which result in the activation of a behavioural script. So for all of you who've been to a conference before, you get in, you drop your stuff off, you go and find the desk, you know, you have to get your badge and sign in. You know what you're doing, you've done it before. It can become really automatic. But the first time you come to a conference, you're like, oh, I don't know where I'm going, I don't know what I'm doing. You know, you're all nervous, you don't know anybody. And you're actually thinking really hard. So you're not talking and chatting, you're walking along thinking, right, what do I need to do? So once you've done that a few times, you've got a script. You click into that, it's cognitively easy. You don't need the same processing. You can chat to somebody, pick up your badge, you know, be doing lots of different things. Normative beliefs. If I believe that it's okay to hit people, then that's going to allow me to select an aggressive script more easily than if I believe it's wrong. Emotions. If I'm feeling angry, then an aggressive script is more appropriate, because it is appropriate if people mess with you or if people push you really hard to use aggression. All of us, I would imagine, if pushed hard enough, would react aggressively. And perception errors, where you have a hostile attribution bias, you perceive malicious intent in other people's actions. If someone comes home late, they've done it on purpose. If someone bumps into you, they're having a pop at you. If someone's looking at you, it's an evil eye. If someone smiles, they're smirking. Now, if you think someone's smirking at you in a rude way, you start feeling angry. If your worldview is like that, so people look at you, they're staring, you feel angry, select an aggressive script. All these things sort of work together to create a behaviour. People who are aggressive don't know this. They say, it just happened, or he was glaring at me. They don't understand how their own sort of predispositions are shaping their perceptions and then their response to their environment. So one of the advantages of the social information processing models is a focus on individual cognitions and behaviours, and it's based on individual learning experiences and an individual's ability to retrieve solutions to actual or potential conflict. In this way, it emphasises the individual differences. So it's something you can use in group, but it's still an individual thing because each person looks at their own cognitions. So one of the things I thought I'd show you, one of the techniques I use, which I was trained in this, and it was interesting, it was fun to do. And it was provocative, it did make you think, was an aggressive choice chain. What they have here is they have emotion as all around. Earlier models of processing used to have it sequential, so you do A, then you move to B, then you move to C, and then you do D. Val Huseman's model says it's sort of really things are going on all at the same time. So you have a fleeting thought, you feel a bit angry, you see something which cues at something else, so, and it's feeding in and out. It's not sort of like a sequence, it's more dynamic than that. So this is an aggressive choice chain. What you do is you typically say have 8 for aggressive incident, and you say, right, start at the first part of this event could have been the morning you woke up, where you've actually been aggressive in the evening. But this could be where, in your mind, the offender, this is where it started. It started when I got up and she hadn't put the car keys back, and so I couldn't find them. And when I tried to ask her, she wouldn't wake up, and, this is where it starts. Or it could be literally, I came home from work, she started having yelling at me, and I lost my temper. And what you do there is you ask men to identify their beliefs. So they'll say, well, women are always doing this. So that's a belief. So then you put it up and you go. So you're talking to them, asking them to talk about this one situation. And as they're doing that, somebody else is writing up all these things, where the beliefs go, where the cognitions go, and so forth. So in this one, the partner swore at this bloke in front of his friend. So what are my choices? He said, well, I could swear back at her. He said, okay. What else could you do? I could ignore her. Okay. What else could you do? I could tell her to apologise. So what are you going to do? Well, calling them a name, that'll earn me respect. So if I retaliate, ignoring them, that'll lose me respect because my mates will think I'm weak. Asking for an apology is pointless because she won't give me one. So my choice, I'm going to call her a name back. Consequence, my peers respected me and I felt better. And then, so the next bit is, so what does she do? So then she probably, and you build up a chain of events. And at each point, you talk about, how did you feel then? You said, well, I felt a bit hot. I felt, my tummy was, feeling like butterflies, or I felt very uncomfortable, or I felt sad. And all the time, somebody's writing these up. And you maybe do one, and then you do the next one, and you keep going. And then you go back with that person and say, look at how your beliefs here, led to this, which led to that. And it really is very powerful. Then you do a choice chain of non-aggressive incidents. So where you could have used aggression, but you didn't. And why didn't you? And what thought processes, what inhibited that behaviour? So you're showing the person that they can use their skills to avert aggression, and you're making it, bringing it out in the open how their minds are working. So that's just one technique. And it's based on hardcore psychological literature. So in the UK, we meant to use interventions which are well designed, firm, empirical basis, supported by empirical research. So I went on Duluth's website last year and found that the Duluth curriculum combines feminist philosophy with an adaptation of Brazilian educator Paulo Freire's work with impoverished, illiterate people in South America. And in what way does that relate to partner violence? In any way at all. I was shocked. I honestly thought, I felt like ringing up and saying thank you, because I was actually writing a piece to critique Duluth, and I couldn't believe they were so naive as to have this on their website. But it isn't naive, is it? It's complacent because no one's checking. Risk. For the programme to work, the What Works literature tells us, it has to be based on an accurate assessment of the risk, need and responsivity of offenders. Duluth choose an approach that systematically addresses domestic violence as a social problem rather than just an individual dysfunction. So you're not going to do a risk assessment because you already know what the risk is. It's, patriarchy. So not only is it an inaccurate risk assessment, there isn't a risk assessment because you already know through gazing at your crystal ball. Life-minded violence, on the other hand, doesn't ever presume to have a crystal ball. Instead, it uses functional assessment, psychological assessment pre- and post-treatment, and actually, subsequently, they're going to carry on sort of at 6 months to see if these changes are maintained. They have individualised treatment targets, and they have a positive psychology, so they build on the strengths as well. Skills-orientated, this is what they need to be. Cognitive behaviour approaches work best. Duluth isn't cognitive behaviour, it's psychoeducational, which is one of the least effective means of trying to intervene in someone's behaviour according to the What Works literature. You need a cognitive behaviour programme. It's the only thing that's likely to work. It may not work, but it's your best chance. Only programmes which are well matched to or modified to meet the needs of the individual offender and can demonstrate treatment integrity, efficacy, and have integrity. Well, does Duluth work? In spite of everything, if it works, then maybe we can just, let it go. Again, I didn't go trawling through the literature to find negative studies. I went to Duluth and looked on their website. on their studies they cite to tell us that it's an effective program. They have the first study compared intimate partner violence subject to mandatory arrest. They found no difference between the two groups. I was like, oh. I mean, it was great in that was really like the first thing they put on. The second one, they critiqued, they spoke about Melanie Shepherd's work, but they just said that there was a treatment effect. And I thought, well, was there? So I emailed Shepherd, and she sent me all the files from this, and there was no effect. Once you control for dropouts and everything else, there was no effect of the program. The studies, the way they talk about things, they act like they have no idea about control groups, scientific rigour, until you think, well, maybe they just need educating. Maybe they just don't get it. It's complicated. We all struggle with some of these finer points. But then on the same website, you see a critique of the US Department of Justice. Found probably one of the best studies I know. It's an attempt to a randomised control sample. And their critique is superb. They pick at every tiny little point. It's like, well, go on and apply it to your research also. So it's not that they don't know, it's that they just selectively apply such expertise. This study found low response rates and high dropout rates. Characteristics that lead to, this was the only, one had an effect, one had no effect. But the one that had an effect was high dropout, low response rate. Those that continue to battle are not likely to participate in the intervention programs. If they participate in the beginning, they're going to drop out. Hence, it's not clear if the result found in the Brooklyn study, which was a very small effect, is actually the result of the evaluation or the result of dropout. Now, what you'll see in Gondorf's work and a lot of the research that says that they're actually effective is that you'll find that they'll say, oh, people who completed 80% of the program, you see this reduction. Okay, well, who are these people then? Who are they compared to who was supposed to start that program? Well, your dropout profile is he's younger, less educated, unemployed, high exposure to violence as a child, severe psychopathology, history of non-domestic violence prior arrest, clinical levels of problems with alcohol. So these are the guys who drop out. And you would predict that from the risk factors we've already discussed. Now, if I did nothing at all, but made two groups, these guys with the other guys, nothing, and then compared them a year later, who's going to have the offence rates? You've literally, again, you're sampling on your DV. You're comparing high-risk guys with low-risk guys and attributing it to a treatment effect. Life-minus violence, on the other hand, is a new program, so we don't know if it works. But the authors and the people running it don't want to continue if it doesn't work. So what they're doing is they're piloting it in Ashworth High Secure Hospital in the UK, one of two high secure hospitals. It's for habitual aggressors, so men who have used aggression more than once. A variety of offences, including family aggression, is quite common as an index offence. High prevalence of personality disorder and psychopathology, which is appropriate because we know that these are the sort of people who are your real hardcore, severely violent, recidivist domestic violence offenders as well. The interesting thing about having psychopaths in there, and it's a large proportion of this sample, maybe a third, psychopaths, is certainly the current European thinking is they're untreatable, and so there's no point trying. Well, if you accept that, then we're never going to know if they're treatable, because if they're untreatable, we won't try, so we'll never know. So they're looking at how psychopaths do behave in group and whether, in fact, they are, whether certain components are more effective with them. They're using a matched controls sample, which is the gold standard for this type of research. People are randomly assigned to treatment or waiting list control. The assessments include functional assessments, the psychopathy checklist. HCR20 is a violence risk assessment with a massive research base behind it, showing it is predictive. A HCR20 tells us who's more likely to reoffend. Good Lives model is about how people view themselves, where they are and where they want to be. And then on top of that, we've got 5 hours psychological assessments informed by the aggression literature. They're going to analyse group effects, individual change scores, and follow up for 2 years, and hopefully continue, but they've got funding for 2 years. So that's a programme. Now, you might say, oh, that's great, but there isn't enough money. If you want to make this case with your policymakers, have a look at the work of Losel, and he does a Losel, L-O-S-E-L. He does cost-benefit analysis of treatment, and his analysis is very persuasive, to the point that if you actually avert one man from a year's prison, that it actually paid for the whole, this one intervention to run for a year. I mean, you know, if you've got to make the case, then that's where I would go. And that's why it's important to evaluate your program. Obviously, you want it to work. So you need to know if it's working, so you need to evaluate it. But if it's working, you can use that then to prevent people pulling your funding. Because you can say, this is averting, this is saving you money. It's not cost effective to pull this program because it's going to cost us money. And you can go to the papers and, you know, say not only are they releasing these brutish people, they're actually costing us money as well. So I'm just going to end on this idea that the aggression literature, intimate partner literature, the risk factors are so similar, I think maybe now or maybe in the next few years, we need to consider whether there's a need for separate programs. We shouldn't be defining aggression by what it looks like, we should be defining it by its motivation. There's obviously different aspects of domestic violence because most people who assault strangers don't go home and then move back in with that person. There are different aspects and you'd have to finesse a program. But unless you know of a program that's based on this, the type of literature, say Life Minus Violence is, if you know that program, fantastic. If not, I would seriously consider, if I was in the position of picking a program, of going with something like Life Minus Violence and running it with domestic violence offenders, because that program took a year. It has international experts from all over the world. It is the most, you know, empirically driven, clinically sound program on paper that I know of. So if I was going to have a checklist to select a program or to fund a program, I'd want to know what its theory base was, and I'd want to know why, what's the process? You know, not X causes Y. Why does X cause Y? So you need to know the process to be able to intervene. I'd want a parsimonious explanation. So if I had an explanation that explained men and women's partner violence compared to two separate ones, then science tells us we go with the parsimonious explanation. There's no need for convoluted explanations if a simple one will do. Risk. Is it empirically derived? Are the risk factors you're measuring, have they come from the literature or have they come from your own ideological beliefs? Is there a good breadth? If you don't sample broadly, you're going to miss risk and then you're not going to be effective. And are you going to target dynamic risk? Are you going to target the things that can change? Treatment, are you going to change the things that matter, not the things you think matter? Is it individuated? Can individual risk profiles be accommodated within this program? Is it process orientated? Do they understand the process? And are you trying to show to the offender how that process works so they can interrupt that process? Evaluation, you want to match control sample, certainly, because you cannot really do anything without matching and comparing your samples. You want to look at risk and recidivism. I think recidivism, I think we all know this, is such a coarse measure. You know, the amount of people who are rearrested compared to the amount of people who actually reoffend, you know, it's a sledgehammer and a nut. So if you actually have risk profiles as well, it's telling you something about psychologically how they changed, as well as behaviourally how they changed. And you want to look at group differences and the individual. So you want to evaluate your group, and you also need to evaluate your individual as well. So lack of support for Duluth's theory. So there's not any apparent sex differences. If you can think of something I've missed, tell me and I'll get some students or I'll do some research on it. You know, if there is differences and I'm missing it, I want to know. I would hate to misinform. Something so important as partner violence. If you can think of something I need to research, let me know and I will go away and research it. No difference in controlling and so forth. Those who use controlling aggression have similar profiles to other aggression people. Have a look at the aggression literature. It's superb. The amount of money that's gone into the aggression literature, you've got neurological, genetic. It's honestly, it's a fantastic area to go and have a look at. And most of it applies to your men and women. So go and have a look. It doesn't have to say domestic violence for it to be relevant. Not all intimate partner violence is the same. You need to do a functional analysis, understand what it means for that perpetrator. And interventions need to be based on risk factors and not politics. So if anyone wants to get a copy of my slides, my email's in my handbook, just email me and I'll send you the PowerPoint and some papers and so forth, or you want to say what a load of rubbish that was, how have you got the goal to come here and say that, or that was superb. Just do. I love getting emails. It's always interesting to know what I did well and what I could do better next time. Thank you very much.